Hello, Andrew here. Welcome to Lecture 10, the final lecture in the Digital Games in Contemporary Youth Culture module. And this lecture, the topic is games in the youth work setting and working with young people in particular. I'd expect this lecture to be quite a bit shorter than the other ones. It'll mostly a recap of what's been gone over so far, and then just pointing towards youth's work environments and youth workers in particular, and the role that they can play around that. And essentially, it'll all lead towards a lot of resources in the toolkit, and a lot of kind of links for bettering youth practice and a youth work practice and a community of practice, really. So, firstly, I'm just going to recap on where we're at with what we've covered so far, and go from there. So, just in terms of the first lectures and the origins of computer games, just started out with me kind of positing these sort of ideas of the convergence along these lines of different technologies and the emergence of different things on the back of that. The origins of games, play, and fun, essentially, just kind of bringing those through from being kind of basic human needs and wants right the way through the 20th century and the later 20th century of just the looking at the emergence of games and the technologies that would encourage that in the form of computer games and different sort of youth culture phenomena with that. Next, we discussed terms and terminologies and philosophy of play, game mechanics, and gameplay principles. Just to give the kind of the wording, just a basic and the sort of a basic understanding of the different wording and the vast number of genres, say, that there are within games. The third lecture, then, we brought it a bit deeper in terms of just the games analysis, looking at Huizinga, Csikszentmihalyi's flow principles, difficulty, ludology, and then Jesper Juhl's concepts of failure within a game, and that sort of more advanced, bringing it right up to where we are really today. The next lecture the fourth lecture was on the history of the simulation game or serious games, and educational games by extension. Also looking at the emergent forms within that, and towards gamified research models where the game elements being put on different types of scientific research and elements like that as well. So from that, then, we looked at the cultural and phenomenological impact of games on youth culture, and bringing it right up to date with it's online celebrity and game related celebrity, be it critiquing or as in players. Esports as an emergent sort of industry, and kind of a potential sort of a prospective career for young people in this environment. LAN parties and just the phenomena of like how people meet and collect and share around games. Redefining and expanding new cyber realities, really, and just kind of touching on that. Right the way through to to the concepts of Jane McGonigal's concept of like super gaming and the transformative power potentially of, be it MMO gaming or just in general the mass access and use of games as an environment and potentially utility to better society. And that kind of logically led on to the next kind of lecture of gamification, which the good sides of gamification are kind of coming through general games practice in particular. So I more wanted to look at the phenomena of that and to see if there was any sort of if there was any precedent to that, where I took up the concept of Taylorism 2.0 and that paper kind of forming this that paper forming a cornerstone of this lecture of a redefinition of working practice, and it not necessarily, I suppose it was a bit more of a cautionary lecture in relation to gamification and how marketing and potentially a redefining of the work environment being presented as a win-win scenario, and looking kind of this, slightly naive compared to some potential realities on the back of that. The next lecture then we looked at games for social change and global justice, looking at games as as campaigns, and the speed that games could be made and produced, that really giving it that sort of allowing it to be a mediating device rather than just an event or a play environment, really looking at how journalism has been redefined by this, and documentary as well, with interactive forms of documentary with that. We looked at Bruno Latour's black boxing theory of concealed technology, and this sort of, being a firm example of the consumptive aspect of technologies, and I suppose games as well, and how this concealed tech can kind of, have potential negative impacts on society, I suppose. And then the other side of that, in terms of the activism, we looked at hacktivism and, new forms of negotiating society essentially around that. And just, we looked at a few examples of projects and work and artists working in that sort of direction. The 8th lecture was on youth exploitation through digital games, which looked at digital labor, ideas of this, end user agreements, SDKs, optimization, bots, lead generations, this, that kind of marketing element to all this as well, and how imbalanced this is, and how little of the, workers' rights in more traditional senses of the word have applied across like digital, transnational environments and companies, really, just to see how rights kind of hold up there with that. So, and again, with the SDKs and the end user agreements, how much of an intellectual property hold over, any sort of pursuits or activities in these free environment, free kind of tools and free tool set environments there actually are. And all this leading towards, potentials of alienation, and a reduction in, rights of young people in particular, and people who are arriving in, a working environment for the first time, and just this sort of culture of internships and, experience being, something akin to, money or being paid essentially in a working environment, and how, the normalizing aspects of this, and obviously the negative aspects of that, where you just have leading more towards like the potential of a slave workforce, really, in relation to what expectations they might have in the work environment. Then the last lecture we had was just looking at the emergent technologies and social movements on the back of that. So looking at how people what it's doing to individual identity and like collective identity online, and looking at like anonymity as an identity, and the persistence of online technology and what that does for identities and avatars. We also looked at, digital archiving, and this sort of how identity fits with storytelling, and all this needs to be remembered or recalled. So the logical knock-on being, how do you save and store this if it's a digital file and an artifact? So archiving being as something which looks like it needs a serious consideration in relation to this. And then by extension, we looked at data protection, storage, and rights on the back of that. So we looked at, programs of mass surveillance by different sort of government intels and stuff like that, and the potential for how that all fits with the role of such, how democratized this is, and the roles of governments in relation to collecting, parsing through information and using it for one means or another, essentially. So all of that is really kind of interesting and, very loaded in some directions. We then looked at, the blockchain and transparency, and the demand of, these technologies essentially demanding a form of transparency. And then the divisions in the web, and, animosity and hate speech and acting on hate, and everything becoming much more divisive and strange in relation to this sort of centralizing of the web. And the hacktivism that comes on the other side of that, be it anonymous groups or, different sort of alt movements, essentially, in relation to this. And, it's 4chan and this kind of freedom of expression and freedom of information being, something, a cornerstone and a principle of the founding principles of the web, and just how they have kind of buffeted up against people's realities, really, where to the tune of like not wanting and to deny other people their kind of rights and freedoms of expression, and all that turning towards hate and violence, and all that being like, as the worst negatives that could possibly happen on the back of that. So I'd hope that that's kind of given a fair spectrum of what has gone on. And as I said at the time, and continue to say throughout, like that, it's it's such a massive and such an interesting area with so much kind of emergent, be it the technologies emergent, also the kind of the behaviors, social movements, advocacy next to this, the theory of, behind all this, and new media sort of theories. And, it's something that is really interesting. And I just wanted to kind of, between the content of those lectures and the relevant links and the cited videos or stuff that was used to illustrate points, all of those things I'd hope would give enough of a kind of a firm introduction into this area, I suppose, and how expansive it is. I suppose if we look at from the gamification lecture onwards, we can see just how gelled this actually is to most things in our everyday life as such, where, it did step out of that sort of more traditional take on a game played environment and has become much more significant and basically a vital part of and a key component of any sort of social movement, new technology, how we negotiate, human welfare rights and business, and how all this happens in a network communicated free environment like the web, being all the kind of vital ends of that, I suppose. So if we look at the, the youth work setting of this, one key part that I, to kind of look at is this idea of advocacy, which I'd mentioned in the first lecture, but just I do want to kind of come back to this of basically we have this, we've the phenomena of these technologies and how they are arriving. We have it set with we have this set with the earliest adopters of this, like the most techno-joy people being the youngest people, really, and people who are, for who they have an inherent they have an innate relationship with these technologies where it's not a strange thing, really, they're fully immersed in a digital environment. And at the same time, they have no legal rights to protect or to express themselves in relation to this. So we're faced with the specter of a top-down approach to how policy is drafted in relation to digital rights, and how we negotiate the digital worlds, and how this impacts on young people in particular. So I find the youth worker to be and the youth sector in particular to be a really important area in terms of advocating on behalf of young people in relation to this and their rights, and protecting their rights and their freedom to those rights. So that's something which can, it's gone through various forms of exploitation, as we've already discussed there, digital labor rights, development education, and how inclusive this all is. All even as far as like digital citizenship, and it's the sort of the responsibilities that come with that, sort of personal responsibilities as well of young people. So there's that dual of representing young people and also giving them the tools, the resilience and the empowerment to do it for themselves as well. The freedom of access and freedom of information to these technologies is a vital thing, in particular with if be it marginalized groups or young people in at-risk situation or as in marginalized communities, where these things are vital and cornerstones for how they relate to the world in a lot of respects, and how they educate themselves and get access to the information. So all of these things are really, really important and vital they're vital to what youth workers and youth centres do in general, but in particular when it comes to the digital realm, they are most urgent and pressing. And then towards bypassing just being consumers of this sort of information and, endless streams of visual media, to develop forms of critical thinking, informed choices, and making those informed choices in regards to access to resources and information, and essentially towards interrupting those sort of signals and the critical thinking coming out of a firm understanding or a can-do attitudes towards different technologies and media, that they can be playful with it and interact with it and change it rather than simple consumption of the same thing, And then, the bigger parts of this, I suppose, or the most prevalent ones, I suppose, is what, if any, effects on mental and physical health this can have on young people, which, it does to a lot of degrees. But I suppose the next question is how much of that is related to the sort of paradigm shift of these technologies and young people, being able to negotiate this sooner and better than, older generations. So it's a case of where does that fit into this sort of this issue of like the resistance or the struggles with that. But overall, helping, assisting any sort of mental and physical health issues that result that emerge as a result of interaction with digital media and social media is something which is a key concern, and was quite a large part of every youth worker's job by now, I'd say. And then obviously, to take the advocacy to the logical ends, it's to really start informing policy and representing young people and their rights in relation to any sort of notions of a top-down sort of emergence of policy in relation to digital media, networked environments, social media, whatever, and we want to look at that, So these things are the vital parts of youth work, as I see it, or digital youth work in particular, and they do have certain crossovers with a lot of traditional forms of how youth work has been practiced to date. So if we look at the youth centre and a few of the key things that why this might be the environment for these things to be negotiated is what form of education is offered in a youth centre, and it's informal or non-formal education, and the vital thing being that it's voluntary in its participation. So therein we instantly have a situation where young people are willing to engage in these particular types of service rather than it being, which is kind of, especially for young people in particular, where everything else is kind of, compulsory. That's quite an interesting thing where there's room for a lot of personal development, a lot of sort of exposure to new ideas, new practices, new things, new skill sets, and all of that coming in this sort of relaxed and informal environment where they can be challenged and grow resilience on the back of that, is all super interesting in terms of digital technologies and gaming in particular, and something which shouldn't really be overlooked at all. When we look at that next to how, schooling, a lot of how schooling has and continues to be sort of, delivered, and the issues of, where this technology is an interruption into formal education. These are things that need to be renegotiated and are in, just at a slower rate in traditional education models by the very nature of curriculum and how examinations happen and how young people are tested in relation to that. So youth centre has this sort of potential to really fill a massive void in terms of, what type of education is available and needed, and to kind of definitely, complement a traditional form of education, but also to inform how that traditional form of education might come about, And it seems really difficult and inflexible, like this, we have this Mackenzie Work talking about this, the holiday of everything being a blame situation, really, where, young people are, to blame for their behavior or lack of attention. In particular, he's speaking about attention in this paper, and that being like an ecology as opposed to an economy. And that idea of it being a singular thing rather than young people who are digital natives, who are fully, this is their innate senses towards digital technologies, and how that is kind of an issue to a more traditional form of education. All these things need to be renegotiated essentially, and can happen in a youth centre as well. So if we look at this idea of attention, really, we see that there's any number of things disrupting that. It's even argued in, what is attention, and how do you aggregate if it's a shorter attention span or whatever it is, that is that sort of shift. I think everyone can agree that the technology is driving a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how people access information, the speed they do it at, how readily they do it, and the kind of that sort of reflective practice or reflective thoughts in relation to learned or lived experience, not really having the time to mature in or gestate in the sense of how people can kind of process those thoughts with this barrage of information culture, or even version on a noise culture with that, So there's a number of factors which are kind of which are challenging this idea of how attention is held and what is holding it, and how relevant or vital that is to anyone's formal education, lived experience, and how they are growing in themselves, really, and becoming fully conscious participant members of a society or relevant respective communities. Another element would be the concept of free, that this things being earned, I suppose, or how if you wanted a book and you invested in a book, well, then you might treasure that object more. I suppose it could be argued in some senses that could be could be a thing. And it's just a case of how much you value, how much value you put on your time, I suppose, being the broader aspect of that, really. I suppose, the ones which we don't really know right now, but there's any amount of theories about, is the biological changes and shifts that are going on as a result of a networked individual in this world, and if you're constantly exposing your visual sense to something in front of a screen as opposed to your other senses, this is kind of having an effect as well, and that's sort of something which needs a different sort of consideration. And then, as I said, overall, just kind of leading all this towards a critical thinking model where young people are resilient, critical in their thoughts, and able to kind of decipher different sorts of thoughts or points of view, and aggregate them together, or to put them together in a way that gives them the resources and the faculties to be able to make those conscious, firm decisions for themselves, rather than being manipulated or consumed by an opinion, a point of view, or some sort of overriding sort of theory, I suppose, in relation to that. So if we look at, I'm just going to go back to that sort of dystopic side of it, where we could look at this idea of everything being free, and Google having the answer to every single question, and what actually exists in your head, and that being an alienating sort of sense with it. And it's the title of a book by Phil K. Dick, but it also works as this sort of cautionary proverb of we can remember it for you wholesale. And just this idea of all right, well, how do you form an identity in relation to these seismic changes in technologies, or potentials for groupthink, or any sort of manipulation or persuasion on the back of these technologies, and the mass mediating aspect of this, and how well prepared young people actually are for these things, So I find a youth worker's job to be really important in relation to that, to kind of intervene in those sorts of direct consuming channels or worries or concerns on the back of that, and to be able to kind of step away from that to the degree of giving people the room, space, and the tools needed for critically thinking and engaging in that, and building a resilience in relation to things that can be quite daunting and overwhelming. And I kind of go back, we had this quote before, but it's a really good one just in terms of the best way to change the future is to play with it first. So we're right back to where games fit in with this and this notion of play and having it as like a much more instructive thing rather than, again, just whiling away things with consumption. And again, this being something that youth work and youth environments can offer to young people with regards to these sorts of different interactions with technologies and really helping to kind of build different experiences of events before they happen, and that essentially leading to a preparedness and all being done in a fun environment, you know. So this is something which is kind of a real interesting way to approach both youth work and to to really engage with young people on their terms where they want to be, and amongst what the types of media and environments that they immerse themselves in. So when we look at the issues in terms of traditional youth work in relation to this, there's just two things. Mostly what I've found is there's a distinct lack of confidence of how to go about this, really, because it looks like there's just a mountain of information, and there's a mountain of technologies, and there's a mountain of different sort of software and apps, and to become really like computer literate before you begin is one thing that kind of certainly holds back. And the other is from youth centers or the whole national sort of youth councils, or advocates for young people at a government and a governance level and at policy level, to kind of define what this is and how best to go about it. So there's a distinct and palpable lack of confidence right through all those ranks in relation to it. And what really happens then is you can see incidents or singular incidents or like more phenomenological things, like something related to behavior, or a really bad use of social media for be it bullying or hate speech, or any sort of like weird, dangerous sort of novelty, social media sort of prank, and all these things having a certain sort of moral panic with them to seem to reinforce this fear element behind that, So a digital youth worker's job has to go beyond that technophore and really meet young people on those grounds and on their terms. And how to do that is with a can-do attitude of, when young people present themselves looking to do something in a digital environment or in a digital domain, that there is the support systems to actually do that. And that's something where which this project, this course, and the whole community of practice around this has to really encourage and enshrine, that there's going to be those support systems. But mostly, it's never been easier. I suppose that's my kind of key. If I had one point to pick out, that it's never actually been easier to access tools and skill sets and to share those same things, to better a youth practice for young people in the digital environment, and for to really enhance the role and to really make reassert a significant role of youth centers and youth work practice in young people's lives. To be able to help inform choices and build trust and responsible users in a digital context. Like there are things that, if we look at traditional youth work, that's exactly what traditional youth work does do. So now we just need to apply it to a digital world. But as I said, it seems to be this misconception that you need to be an expert before you begin, where truly, if you look at it as like a game and it's something to be experienced, with and in and amongst young people, and for it to emerge out of that, this is probably, this could lead to the best type of youth practice, which is one which is youth led. So if if we look at it on those terms, we have young people who are interested, have the desire to work and do and, be safe and play and have fun and challenge themselves in these types of environments. That's exactly what the type of environments that youth workers and youth centers would like to foster. So by extension, to enable that sort of situation to happen, takes a very little in terms of, a starting point. And then it's just a case of to confidently kind of help that along the way and to have a can do when there's options suggested, and mostly to put it all into a focus of a youth work environment which challenges preconceptions and really kind of, helps with critical thinking and building resilience in young people that they can do that. These are all things that are central to game design or gameplay. So, the digital environments in youth work, and it's in particular with games, they're so closely linked that it's kind of uncanny, I suppose. So it's really a case of taking that bull by the horns and running with it, and just having that sort of confidence to do that. As I said, the masters that this module is part of, this is what it intends to do, really, and we'd like to believe that by the end of this, all youth workers would have that basic sort of aptitude and confidence, mostly across all these sorts of disciplines, which are pretty much convergent to be the one thing, and to allow a really dynamic sort of confident approach to that. Things which young people instantly feed off and respond to, and the suggestions are naturally forthcoming on the back of that. I just want to look really quickly at some best practice, just different toolkits for that. First, where there's any number of, be it online forums and instructional videos, freeware, Creative Commons. It's mostly just to outline it's not essentially an expense, and it's not all some sort of horrendous situation where you that sort of, there's no such thing as if something is free, then you're probably the product, granted to a degree. But on the other end, there's any number of Creative Commons or educational toolkits out there already, and mostly the support and sharing skill sets and experience through a community of practice has never been easier. So all those things combined really bode well for digital youth work, and fostering a really interesting international best practice of the same, and sharing the best results of that, and also the failures of that, because that's the vital part to kind of put it on its right course. Just to give one really interesting example of it, I mean, overall it's probably easily argued that Finland are really advanced in relation to how digital youth work is as practiced and supported there, and the vital role it has in young people's lives and in the broader sort of culture is something really interesting. This one project, the Pelitalo project by Verke, is a really interesting one, which is taking on esports, and it's youth work basically that is conducted in an esports environment. So there's a professional esports player, young people who are really dedicated and interested in esports, and a youth worker, all immersed in the same game environment, and this is where the youth work is conducted from. So there seems to be something in Finland whenever it looks like it's difficult or awkward, that they just seem to have the can-do attitude to the tune of just parachuting youth workers into the most extreme example of it, and really trying to understand and meet young people at that sort of level, which is super, super interesting. Quite contentious in some corners, when you just see that, how do you talk about violence if you're playing a violent game in an esports environment? These things are kind of, interesting. But the vital thing, I suppose, to get across, and it's a really interesting one, is really turning up to meet young people on their terms and in the environment that they want to be in and they're most comfortable in. And once you're there, the trust is built. And then there's all the good youth work and the informed sort of practice and reflective sort of practice of it can happen at that point, rather than being outside of the same thing, fearing it, and, just it being branded as some form of antisocial behavior. So here's some photos from the same sort of, the same project. And, in terms of what you have young people who do want to meet, which is how it is always going to be. And you potentially have a lot of, young people that, wouldn't expose themselves to group environments or think that they have a lot of shared identities with people outside of a virtual or online identity by now, all meeting into one place with a physical element of that as well. So, this is a really interesting form of practice. And, we already have a number of best practice models of that. Again, all this stuff will be in like the resources and toolkits really, but I just wanted to point this one out as being a super interesting way to conduct youth work. And mostly that's sort of to have the can-do attitude and the resources to really go at that with confidence and the support that youth workers and youth centres really need to take this on, and also to learn along the way and to share all that experience towards a best practice. All these things are really important and interesting. So in terms of the game design element then, rather than just the playing side of it, well, we talk about the playing side of it a little bit more first. The concepts, we've spoken about them at length over, but when it looks like difficulty, where the ideas of play, all these things are cornerstones of a good game, and instant sort of introductory points for meeting and engaging young people who might not necessarily engage with a service. So you kind of bypass this idea of an antisocial behavior straight away. It's just a type of behavior that a lot of traditional forms of youth services don't really respect, understand, or give a lot of sort of currency to. So this redefinition of what is antisocial is one thing that needs to happen. In youth work by its very nature is probably the closest to a gamified sort of work environment where play, challenge, difficulty, all these things being conducted on young people's terms are all, part and parcel of that type of work. So there's a really interesting thing that can happen as a result of that. When we look at game design and, critiquing games essentially, or the things that young people love to do, it's very easy once you meet at that level to expand on that then, and to really get under the bonnet and talk about why something is good, why it works, why other people might find it offensive, what is the, the motivation, what is the difficulty elements of this, was the difficulty of producing it then, which is another thing which kind of works on this idea of, be it to do it attention or to do it like, a time-based practice of learning, or, having to kind of reflect on something and to kind of go a bit deeper, where scalability through iterating designs and evolving something evolves the game in terms of you have a perfect illustration of the progress of that work, but it also evolves a youth practice for that particular project, which is bespoke to that. So this idea that you have young people who want to build a game, who reference other games that they want to build, which allows for critical thinking of what might be good or bad, or the pros and cons about that, why other people might find that offensive, and all these things to kind of be really experiential critical thinking models that can engage young people into something they're interested in. Then really quickly, with the computing power and the technologies, it can move fast towards building iterations and different illustrations of this, be it like characters, levels, writing theories for writing kind of game, best practice for games and stuff like that, all towards building resilience and playful approaches towards difficulty, and all these things essentially delivering, a best youth work practice. So it's all a bit short what I'm kind of getting at. I'm not going to speak for much longer about all this, but that's essentially where we're at in terms of what can be achieved. I'm sorry, I have a dog barking his head off behind me here. And that's kind of, I just wanted to kind of, outline that and the importance of youth work in relation to this. So after that, we're just going to look at different, relevant links, modules, and, build a community of practice to that end. So I hope that was informative enough, and thank you very much. Okay.